Hi everyone, delonewolf here and welcome back to EVE Talk, your weekly look at the market in EVE Online. And when it comes to news in EVE Online, we got a few new videos, that's pretty cool. We got a scope that showed some of the Edencom development, you could say, around the memorial, and then the other side, of course. I thought that was really cool, and also probably some breadcrumbs in there. So a spokesman for the Triglavian collective who basically said that everyone gets a chance in the proving and come join the flow. So pretty interesting. I do wonder what CCP has planned for that storyline. Could be that it'll take a very long time before anything actually moves in game, but I'm sort of thinking at the moment the Empires really, I don't see them standing that much of a chance against the Triglavians, considering the technology that they are displaying with their super motherships, how they're able to manipulate stars, and just the scales at which they are operating is just completely mind-blowing to us. But what could of course eventually force them to treat us a little bit more like equals and going the peaceful route could of course be what the drifters or the sleepers could do to them, perhaps in Pogven, but perhaps also in the Abyss, of course, where they should have an enormous amounts of resources considering what they're doing. So I think that's very cool. A couple more breadcrumbs, and then someone also showed like orbital shipyards that are active now in Pogven for the Triglavians, where they're building more stuff. So it's actually pretty impressive. I should definitely try to visit that region. We also got a new Pulse video. The new information there is that the next quadrant should start in November. So the gateway quadrant that we're in at the moment is sort of like a transition towards a new state for EVE Online that should herald the end of scarcity. That could be very interesting, of course, but for now we don't have any concrete information on what that means. I personally can't wait for the dev blogs to explain a little bit what CCP's plan is. And then next up, let's take a quick look at the new Eden store as well, see what's happening here. I thought there was like a skin bundle that was up as well for like old or special skins gold cell. Can't say that I have seen that very often. Let's take a quick look at that. Okay, Astero and Nestor. All right, well, man, that looks pretty cool. Blue cell. All right, quite a few bundles front and center, basically, that allow you to get some of those skins that you may have missed, like Mortus Hex, Blood Raider Hex. Those are pretty damn cool. Neon Utopia, if you like something a little bit more exotic. So very nice. And then on the services front, we just have a couple of HOTS, so nothing special to report there. That means we get to move on to the market itself. As always, we start with some plex and stuff, and that's coming in at timestamp 3:20. There we go. Let's get started on Plex, and you may already have seen it on the ticker, but Plex has definitely broken out a little bit. 1 year high point and above 2.8 million on the chart, still only just above there. But if we go to the market data for JITA, 2.9 million for the sellers, 282 million for the buyers. So this chart still has to catch up a little bit. We are going higher for Plex. They are becoming more expensive, and yeah, starting to be a little bit of a trade that you could do if you manage to buy, let's say, below 2.3 million at the very bottom in April. You are looking quite golden. That should put pressure on the multiple pilot train certificates. Yeah, last week they were trying to pull back a little bit, but you can see now that the pressure is starting to mount here as well, and we are touching 1.4 billion on the chart. We're above that for the sellers and above 1.3 billion for the buyers. So that upwards pressure should really be felt throughout most of this segment. Here are the skill extractors also reaching a 1 year high point. A bit of hesitation once we go above 330 million ISK, 324, 325. So a little bit of supply coming in here, taking advantage of these high price points, but also 319 for the first buyer. That's just a 5 million ISK margin between sellers and buyers on something that costs 300 million ISK. That is exceptionally low of a margin, showing that strong demand does exist in the game at the moment. Impact on the injectors. Let's see if the upward trend is continuing. Well, another push up, but again hesitation at a very round number. You could say here here on the chart, you can see that we're flattening out at the 680 million mark. It's 677 million for the sellers, 658 for the buyers. Again, same story. That's how much? 19 million of a margin between sellers and buyers on something that costs over 600 million is definitely not a lot. I think what's happening here is that this is the highest point we've reached in almost a year. Some sellers are coming out to take advantage of this price point. Then we've got the small scale injectors that have done a jump up as well with hesitation over the last couple of days, but up to 140, again closing in on that 1 year high point, in this case in fact matching it on the chart, and as a result 138 million for the first seller, 39 for most, and then 131 million for the buyers. Same story, I think we did push above 140 because here 4 days ago you get 141 million, but there is some supply. There are some sellers, in my opinion, probably some speculators that did manage to buy here June, April, let's say below 130. They're already looking at those profits and they're unloading at least some of it to make sure that they're selling at the height of this chart right now. What will the future pertain for these prices? That's still very difficult to say, and for me honestly plex is gonna be a little bit of the barometer. That's definitely the thread I think through all of these items is that they're basically at least partly a conversion of plex, and as a result if plex manages to really break out, let's say to 2.9 million, I do expect more upwards pressure on these as well. If we see more hesitation in plex, then we could stall and we could actually pull back on some sellers coming in trying to take advantage of these prices. The daily alpha injector next, very impressive honestly, not exactly a move but flat, well above 45 million ISK. I think story is sort of confirmed that CCP is kind of successful when it comes to attracting new people. They of course have been pushing that very hard in this quadrant specifically. Latest thing is that the Mac client has been released. That should also bring some new players in. We've got the Epic Store, we get a new player experience, and then of course we also have like Preach, for instance, with to take a look at the game for 24 hours. Very popular videos that will undoubtedly have attracted some people to come and take a look. And then I would say that does show that, in my opinion, the daily alpha injector is a very successful item, despite the fact that in general, considering the sandbox, we would not like this dynamic, because of course this does create skill points straight into the game after being purchased from CCP, which is like really an iffy thing, but we've basically let go of the skill point thing, since those are being created in many ways. And I can sort of understand if you want to give new players at least somewhat of a chance, or at least somewhat of a feeling that they can catch up to older veteran players that already have hundreds of millions of skill points, you have to do stuff like this. And so this is what's happening here for the daily alpha injectors. Current sell price is at 48 million, buyers at 44 million, again 10% margin on this one. Probably a little bit less than that is actually decent, I would say, for something that is being traded back and forth, but also it is below that 50 million mark, which is an overseeable goal for alpha players. And then finally we get the hypercores that are sort of confirming that a little bit of inflation may be on the books at the moment, as we are pulling up from 290,000 heading towards 300,000. It's 295 almost for the sellers, 282,000 for the buyers. Again, pretty narrow margins, showing that it's also strong demand that's helping push these prices up. Not just inflation numbers, because the active ISK, as we've seen in September, actually went down on fewer on losing some accounts, and I think it is gonna be those accounts that just play the game for the massive fleet fights, for the huge wars in EVE Online, and they tend to already be more established players that will have quite a bit of ISK in those player accounts. Next up, the minerals market coming in at 935. There we go. Again on the ticker you may have seen this as well, but titanium tries to stem the bleeding. Basically we're up a little bit from last week on some volume, so this may be a bit of purchasing that has pushed the price back up towards 440 for the sellers, 413 for the buyers. But I also do think that fresh supplies will come in pretty quickly, and unfortunately it looks like we are not going to go back to 450 anytime soon, since we still have like 1.5 billion units that are ready on the market below that price point, and there should still be active supply that is going to keep competing with this. Potential reason for this volume could be the industry that's picking back up, especially in Delft. They've been producing quite a lot, but there's other Nelsec regions as well where they're very active, and I'm personally seeing this as a bit of another arms race that's happening at the moment after the huge fight that basically involved almost everyone in Nelsec. Everyone has retreated back to their home sectors or have established their home sectors, and now it's time to build up. Even if those capital ships are not very economical to make, they represent power in the game, and thus there is a need to make more dreadnoughts, make more carriers, so that if and when actually the next war comes out, you are ready and you're able to take part in that. For pyrite we get a little bit of the same. In fact, 5-day moving average moving back above the 20-day moving average, almost 17 is for the sellers, 16 for the buyers, but you can clearly see that we have gone back up to a level that's below the average we managed to do after the industry changes. Then we have the Mexalon chart that's actually continuing to pull back down. 55.92 for the sellers and 54 ISK for the buyers. Should form a bottom pretty soon, probably around the 55 ISK mark, but that is definitely a strong departure from, well, before the industry changes, and even the historical average. I would say 75 ISK for Mexalon would, in my opinion, be like a normal average price range. This does feel like we're losing a little bit on the high minerals when it comes to value. Yeah, it's also kind of normal if you have a lot of new players. Quite a few of them will choose the safe and relatively safe and steady career of mining and at least check it out for a while. It just means more supply, and that is squashing the prices, and thus your ISK per hour unfortunately goes down. Diversification, make sure that if you start out EVE Online with mining, which I did, I went up into a Hulk and I mined for a very long time to get like to my first billion ISK, so you can imagine that that's quite a long haul, but in the meantime I also did discover exploration. I did some missions with my brother. I do think it is important, if you want to stick with EVE in the long term, that you don't just stick with mining, because eventually you'll want to do something else as well, or something like this. You could get some very bad periods where your efforts are not really worth it because so many other players are doing the same thing. Then we get Isogen. Someone mentioned that they saw regions where it reached 80 ISK, and yeah, I would not be surprised on that. You can see here in Jita we're staying just below 70 on the chart, but we keep pushing those daily averages, keep pushing at the high side of things, so there is some supply coming in that's constantly keeping us within the 70 ISK range for the sellers. It's 66 for the buyers though. That's just 3 ISK on a 60. That's like less than 5%, definitely a low margin, showing that strong demand. And if someone is mentioning that they're finding places where Isogen is going for 80 ISK, that just to me is another indication that what we still have to go through is here 130 million ISK, 18 million, 16 million ISK units, excuse me, down here a couple of 36 million units at 83.50. Let's keep that in mind. But these are still those old reserves that are being chewed through by the market at the moment. But of course, in smaller markets away from Jita, you are far more likely to hit that point where those old reserves are gone. You now have to actively bring in the Isogen from low-sec, mostly wormhole space, Triglavian space, etc., in order to meet the demand that's there, and that is going to mean higher prices than where we're at now in Jita, because here we still have someone that's able to bring 130 million units in a single batch to the market, which in those other markets is probably almost impossible to do. So I think we are again set for another leg up here in Isogen at some some point. 130 million units is still a lot, but I also do, it's of course a super complex dynamic here, because there will be other people that if you think the same thing, you'll start to nibble at those 130 million, trying to sell them back perhaps here at like an 80 million. So it's always going to be a rough ride to actually get to that new consensus price, as there will be people that are looking at it from both sides. But you can see here that we are, doing those steps, and they are slowly moving up, and I think we're not done yet. Then we've got the Noxium chart that, well, is back up a little bit, so back to right in the middle, I would say, of this 1000 to 1250 range. It is 1100 for the sellers and almost 1100 for the buyers as well. It's actually narrowed down quite nicely on that 1100 ISK price range for Noxium, which, if you compare that to the 70 ISK for Isogen, is actually very expensive. And this is, in my opinion, the dynamic that we will see at some point in Isogen as well. Sell orders 5 million is the largest one. Now here we get one of 15 million, so sometimes you do get a little bit bigger supplies, but most suppliers are able to just bring a couple 100,000 units to the market rather than 130 million or something like that. And that does mean, of course, that you start to get a more wavy pattern, as supplies can sometimes outdo demand and sometimes not. Here there's far more speculation and oversupply that's at play in these prices. Then for Nullsec we've got Zydrine, very flat, yeah, definitely pretty flat here for the last couple of months. 854 for the sellers, 845 for the buyers, very narrow margin, and basically a more stable situation than Noxium and Isogen, which is bringing in that not just the lower prices than Noxium, but also the more stable situation. And Megaside actually seems to be oversupplied at the moment, as we are breaking down to the 550 on the chart, 560 for the sellers, 560 for the first buyer, but we go down to 550 for most of these. So there is actually a little bit of dumping happening as well if you want to get these average prices. So a little bit too much Megaside coming to the market. Well, for industry, this could be good news, as bit of pressure on the high-sec minerals, bit of pressure on the null-sec minerals will hopefully keep the net result in check when it comes to the higher Isogen prices. As a result, you may have a bit of a better time finding margins in industry. Next up, the PI market. That's coming in at 1725. Let's see what we can spot here. So I'm mostly at the moment seeing the advanced PI materials as a gauge for industrial activity and for general activity in the game, but especially around industry, since a big change in April with the changes to industry for Tech 1 is that for the larger ships you need advanced PI materials in those as well, carriers, freighters, all that sort of stuff. And you can see here that we actually bumped up to the 2 million ISK for broadcast nodes. We're coming back down from that a little bit on a big purchase. 1.85 almost for the sellers, 1.76 for the buyers. Very narrow margin again, strong demand, high price. I would say that, yeah, this does kind of confirm or hints at the arms race in null-sec really picking up. They need those broadcast nodes, so even if you make them in high-sec, they're willing to pay the price to move them in and to turn those then into larger ships. Construction blocks are starting to move up just a little bit, but still in a very bad spot historically speaking. 7,700 for the sellers, 7.5 for the buyers. Another narrowing margin, showing perhaps a pickup in demand here again. But yeah, let's not forget that the historical average price for refined PI materials is around 10,000 ISK. I'd say 10.5 for construction blocks was normal. Consumer electronics were in fact a little bit more pricey than that, and they are still stuck at 6,000 ISK, 6,200 for most sellers, 5.8 for the buyers. So we're also slightly narrowing the margin here, but not by too much. Coolants then had the jump back to 10,000 disc, which is its historical average. That's actually very impressive. A run-up like that does mean a little bit of a correction, of course, but we are staying pretty high. 10,300 for the sellers, 9.8 for the buyers. If there's one thing that you can try to sell at the moment at a very reasonable price compared to everything else for the refined PI materials, it is definitely coolants, which is something that I have still been producing for months and months and months and not selling because of how bad the price was. And that's going to be one of the advantages of doing PI that's tied to fuel production. There is a different demand dynamic there. Then we get the cryoprotectant solutions. Personally, I think that this bubble here, you could say from 100,000 to 110,000, will have been a little bit of speculation on an implant announcement that just didn't work out, never really materialized, and as a result the market eventually comes back into its normal state, which at the moment is oversupplied, and so sellers are dipping back below 100,000 disc, 93,000 for the buyers. You can once again buy cryoprotectant solutions below 100,000 disc. If you're looking to still stock up on that gamble that eventually CCP will come out with an implant set, then you can still get back in on the game. But honestly, I would always look at doing small purchases so that you can keep buying if there is more pressure on the price, and not disrupt the market like that with all of a sudden trying to buy like 100,000 units or something of that nature, which I think is what happened here. A couple of really high volumes pushed the price back up, probably on some bad supply days, and then that just spooks the market. But eventually the actual dynamic takes over, and so unless all of a sudden CCP does come out with that announcement, you're way too early and in my opinion too aggressive. Enriched uranium then tied to fuels made its way back almost to 9k, is sort of stabilizing here as well, 9,400 for most sellers, 9.1 for the buyers. Again, that's quite a narrow margin here. All of a sudden we haven't seen that in PI for a long time, but looks like demand for fuel is definitely up. Integrity response drones are definitely holding at a pretty high average. Almost 1.8 million for the sellers, almost 1.7 million for the buyers. Mechanical parts for fuel starting to see a little bit of upwards momentum here at the end as well, and those lows keep going higher. So again, this is tied to fuels. 7.8 for the sellers, 7.6 for the buyers. Narrow margin, strong demand, tied to fuels. Confirming that story, but still has a ways to go. I would say here again, 10,000 disc is a normal average for mechanical parts. Nanites are working their way back up a little bit as well, but from a price of 4,500 disc for a refined PI material, that is very low. So 5.2 for the sellers, 4.8 for the buyers. Feels honestly like a little bit of a bounce from close to a 1-year low point. Nano factories then, these have been losing a little bit of momentum after reaching 1.1 million about a month ago, and they are going for 840,000 for the sellers, 817 for the buyers though, so that's again pushing up quite strongly. We could see higher prices after this sort of a lull after really spiking up in 1.5 months from 700,000 to 1.1 million. Perhaps a little bit too much too quickly does of course result in a pullback. Then organic motor applicators, 730 for the seller, 672 for the buyers. These are definitely suffering a little bit of an exception. I would say most of the time they manage to stay above 750. Here we are trading pretty low on the organic motor applicators. I think we need a little bit more time to try to figure out if this is like the new price under which you can buy and then try to sell close to 900. Something like that could of course be very nice. Recursive computing modules, still bad chart, 1.1 million, 1 million for the buyers. Not a lot of buyers here in the market, but again they're pretty aggressive considering those sell prices. Then robotics manages to stay above 60,000, 62 to 60,000 here, narrow margin, so a little bit more demand does seem to be in play, but again it's quite relative. 100,000 disc is actually normal reference point for me, historically speaking, for robotics, so this is not much more than a bounce up from a 1-year low point. Self-harmonizing power cores then staying at 1.6 million, 1.6 for the buyers as well, so that strong demand is here for advanced. Sterile conduits, and this one we saw that last week was definitely dropping off after staying above 1.1 million for a bit. We're down to 900,000 for the sellers, 900,000 for the buyers. That gap has closed. This is the end of the line for the drawback. And I do think that we will be moving back up here, and obviously all of this triggered by a big volume. Someone came in, had a lot of Sarah conduits, and is basically causing this glut in the price at the moment. So it's a good time for people that need sterile conduits in their industry processes to try to snag some, because I do think when active supply demand comes back in and you don't get this disruption of like 3 times the normal volumes, that then we will be going back up above 1 million pretty quickly on the consensus price. Ukami superconductors still seeing some upwards pressure as well. 77,000 for most sellers, 85 pretty quickly, and then 70,000 for the buyers. And finally the wetware mainframes, that's a little bit better. So there's definitely categories between advanced PI materials, and this one is back to almost 1.8 million, 1.7 million for the buyers as well. They're showing that strong demand, and we're back at a very high point on the chart. So PI doing quite well. Coolants is a nice surprise for me personally, because I do have a lot of that I can now sell at a much better price. Especially considering, you know, it's a high tax rate in Dital, but I mostly pay taxes on coolant price of maybe 6,000-7,000 disk. If I can sell it for 10k now, that's still a pretty good, a pretty good deal in general. Next up, advanced moon materials coming in at 2540. There we go. As always, carbides are first for Galente crystalline carbide, carbonide, confirming that the margin compared to the start last year is in, but the volatility has clearly left this market a little bit. 185 for the sellers, 178 for the buyers. Well supplied, decently strong demand. You can expect this to basically stick in that 175 to 200 range for now. Then we've got titanium carbide for Caldari, definitely showing what I'm talking about here, completely losing all the volatility that started in April and basically right around the 200 disk mark, where before 150 came into play quite often. 200 for the sellers, 181 for the buyers. Then for Fernite carbide for Minmatar, same story, a late spike in May, quickly absorbed by the market, and then moving instead of a 1 to 150 range in a 150 to 200 range. It's 170 for the sellers, 162 for the buyers. And then for Amar tungsten carbide, right here you can see again, most of the time we move around the 150, sometimes below, and now we're again in the 150 to 200 range. 177 to 171, narrow margin. That all should help keep things pretty stable, but again, definitely a bit more expensive than a year ago. The metamaterials basically haven't shown that margin, so let's start here with photonic metamaterials for Galente. A little bit of a surprise volatile spike that was very quickly absorbed by the market, and we're right back around that 1250, which you can see on this full chart, sometimes below, sometimes above that, but definitely seems to be a reference price. 12,200 for the sellers, 11,800 for the buyers. Pretty normal price for metamaterials. Then we've got the Caldari one that is here, non-linear metamaterials. Kind of the same story. We got a March spike in this case, perhaps on the announcement of the industry changes, but then turns out, it's only take one, so you were wrong. We absorbed that, and 20 to 25,000 has been the range most of the time, and you can see we're still nicely in that range. 21,000 to 20,000 for the sellers and buyers. Then for Minmatar, it's Plasmonics, which again at the start of last year we had a little bit of a dip, but if we can disregard that and then the two spikes here in April and in February, just below the 20k mark is where we mostly settle at on average. 18,000 to 17.5, narrow margin, so a market I think that has its consensus price and is definitely pretty happy to stay there. And then finally we've got the Amar 1 terahertz metamaterials that at the moment is dipping off just a little bit, but again with the April spike here we need a little bit of time to absorb all of that, but that 12 12,500 to 17,500 does seem to be that average range, and we're around 15,000 to 14,000 on this one as well. Then the other advanced materials, so this stuff is all tied to Tech 2 production for the different factions, so mostly ships but also some other stuff. But then we get the other advanced materials, and there the story is quite different. A lot of these have been struggling for most of the year. We can see fermionic condensates that start here at almost 80,000 disk, definitely the high point, when as low as 50k just about a month ago. Early September is recovering from that a little bit, but we're still at 63 to 61,000, so still a 20k loss compared to the start of the year. Ferrogel then, whoops, nope, that's not Ferrogel, this is Ferrogel. Started the year at 30k, which was already a low price, so not all of these charts are going to show that exact same story, but just trust me on this, 30k for Ferrogel is actually already a low price. Then we had a little bit of speculation and some more action around the industry changes, but honestly a little bit of a boom here in September as well. That is being absorbed quite nicely. 32,000 for the sellers, 30,000 for the buyers. It is the average price for the year, but it's still, historically speaking, a pretty low one. Then we get Fullerites, which is also, basically we have started now on a chart that starts below the previous consensus prices, because I very clearly remember that Fullerites had a very good time staying above 1000 disk before this entire chart. And so here we start at 750, we end at 750, April bump, but this is basically still a low price, 760 to 740, so 750 is definitely the consensus there. Then we get hypersynaptic fibers. So here again I would say that we start at 11k, which was more of a consensus price before this chart, and then we start to drop off, a couple of spikes, but in general right now we're below 9000 disk. Definitely seen hypersynaptic fibers go for more than 10k most of the time. So it's that pressure again. 8,800 for the sellers, 8,700 for the first buyer, 8,600 for the next one. So again, pretty low, definitely suffering a little bit. Nano transistors, same story. I really clearly remember that before this we had a very long period where at massive supplies we were at 5k, and when we were not seeing enough supplies, we would then spike up to 6k. So this was the previous range for nano transistors. Basically we've been in this state for over a year now. We do have a little bit of extra action, right? A pull up, you could say, on this chart around April, around the industry changes, but in general that was still a relatively low price, the low bound of what we used to know nano transistors at. And so now we're at 4.5, away from the bottom price, but 4,000 for the buyers is still pretty low. Phenolic composites, same story again. Starts at 1750, goes down to 1250, bit of a better time around April, and then here at the moment I would still say it's pretty cheap. 1600 for the sellers, 1500 for the buyers. Pressurized oxidizers, so we can go over these a little bit more quickly. We're not really seeing any moves on the charts yet. They're just so new that it's gonna be difficult to see any major shifts in this. And then we get the ceramic fibers. Also went, this one was a little bit different, where we did have that 300 range at the start of the year, which again I think was pretty cheap. But then April, again with the industry changes, had a nice period at 500 disk, which I would say was probably better than the average price, or around the average price. So basically a recovery for ceramic fibers, and actually phenolic composites had that a little bit as well when it moved towards 2k, but right here at the tail end you can see not sustainable, and we're heading back down towards 300 at the 340 to 315 for ceramic fibers. So that's the story in advanced materials. The carbides, they've got their premium, they've lost their volatility since April, and they're basically moving around a new higher consensus price. Metamaterials have been very stable over the last year, and basically on that historical price range. I think they're looking pretty good, but the other advanced materials are generally actually suffering from a low price, historically speaking, even though it's now been going on for such a long time that it's not very visible anymore on the charts. Let's take a look then at the Tech 2 ships next, coming in at 3340. There we go. Honestly, still just hunting for potentially good deals over the last week. A little bit of pressure on the basilisk price, but not enough to make me want to jump in. 211 for the sellers, 195 for the buyers. So the one thing is, you're buying a basilisk below 200 million ISK. If you want to take the gamble, I definitely would not blame you, but I'm sort of hoping for a better chart before I decide to jump in. Then we get the Cerberus. That one is dropping off a little bit and chart starting to touch 200 million. That could be more interesting. 200 million for the first seller, 210 for the buyers, but 208, excuse me, for most sellers. But yeah, too aggressive still for me. 197.6. That's practically 200 million for those buyers as well. Drop off below 190 million, and then we can talk. But the chart starts to look interesting. A bit more pressure could actually make that happen. But for now, still a little bit early for me. Although you could probably buy a Cerberus below 200 million. And then here, when we noticed it last week as well, here is the Guardian continuing to go down despite an average price of 180 on the chart. And now it's 173 for the sellers, 165 for the buyers. And then you've got not a lot of buyers in the market anymore. Let's take a quick look to make sure that there's not too much buying happening. Pretty much the same in perimeter as well. So I think we can keep the view like this. And then if you look at my completed trades, I do think I should have a Guardian in here. A summer trade was a 185 to a 200 million ISK. So this is definitely, for me, looking like we are in the bargain range. We're close to 1 year low point. We're below the chart. We broke down below everything that happened since February. So this is definitely potentially a nice place to try to grab a Guardian. And I said this in, I think, the couple of weeks when we were starting to see that pressure come in here as well. So yeah, that's that one warning, right? It can happen. We can get oversupplied in some of these Tech 2 ships, especially on this lower or rebuilding period in nullsec, and thus waiting for the right opportunity, having a little bit of patience, not jumping in now because you can buy a basilisk below 200 million, to me makes a lot of sense. But now the Guardian, I think, is pushing super low demand, and eventually this will break down. Right now would be, a good time to set up a buyer. I think you can really easily buy one below 170 and have a high chance on this pressure that it'll actually trigger, that someone will bring in a Guardian, see this state, see for instance a 168 and say, yeah, that's just 4 or 5 million, I'm just gonna sell, grab it, it's fine. If we start to see that turnaround, then you're generally too late for those aggressive buy orders. Then we get the Hound, also pulling back, but this one to me not really breaking down just yet. We're basically playing with the bottoms that we've seen over the last month since February as well. 24 million for the sellers, 22.5 for the buyers. Not a lot of buyers, lose some of that. Bit more pressure, and this is a lot of pressure. Another 60 ships right here in just the last hour or so, but those buyers are pretty aggressive on this chart as well. I would love to see this break back down to 20. Then of course we, just like with the Guardian, in my opinion, have a very nice jumping point. Ikitursa pretty flat, so that's okay. I would say 650 million for the sellers, 625 million for the buyers. It's of course super expensive for a cruiser, but it is one that you have to import from the clades somehow, so you gotta get it done. It's not that easy, but it's of course so unique and cool. And Triglavians, different story, different part of EVE Online at the moment, so making those ships premium is pretty cool, of course. Then we get the Ishtar, and here we are going to be a little bit late. So last week I said, yeah, probably looks like a good time to be jumping in on the Ishtar if you can get in on the buy order now. We're at 195 to 190. I don't know what the buy prices were last week, but I think they'll be lower than this. Let's see what we can get here on the average price. Average price seems to be close to 190, but it's right at the end of this downturn. That's the best place to buy, and here you're a little bit late, but again we were below the February chart here, so that looked like, if you want to make that investment again for the longer term, look pretty good. And I think you could have bought an Ishtar below 190, and then you can see on that on that shift, it's because someone comes in and just says, you know, 190 low enough for me, I'm buying 10 of them, and that's just putting that floor here. That's going to be very difficult again to be aggressive with your buys. Then we've got the Manticore. That one has just moved in that 25 to 30 million range too steadily. 30 for the sellers, 27 for the buyers. So that's a no for investing right now. Munin is dropping off a little bit. If you go below 180, that looks good. 185, unfortunately, for the sellers. 189, almost 190 for the buyers. So that's a really narrow margin. Again, that's a no. If this has any more momentum and touches the 180, that should drive out the 180 plus buyers. That's potentially what we want to see, of course, to do a purchase. The Nemesis had that here for just a moment, but at the moment it's back high up. 25 for the sellers, 22 for the buyers. So that's again too narrow margin. Oniros right in the middle again. Big volume that hasn't moved the price just yet. Perhaps we'll see something next week. 193 to 173. That's a big margin, but also it is, of course, a much smaller market. So be careful there. The Panther going down and staying down, so that's, you know, should mean, in my opinion, that we don't see too much pressure price-wise on the production costs. 1 million for the sellers, a bit above a billion, excuse me, for the buyers. So this to me feels like that stability that has come back to the carbides, and then the OK metamaterials that are basically on their normal averages means that the volatility has left this market a little bit, and we're back on okay, we know what our margins are, we know what our normal prices are, and thus our opportunities are rarer, but if you can spot them, it's of course a good chance. And this looks like another one that could be nice. Here's the Purifier going down, breaking down to pretty much a low point since and below February, so this could be quite nice. Let's see if we can get another line going. So below 22.5, we're touching that here again. 22.5 for the sellers, 21.5 for the buyers. They're right on top of this, but yeah, you can buy a Purifier below 22 million, which honestly is probably a good thing, and you can do that probably right now on all of that sell pressure, but it may not last very long. Same with the Guardian. Then the Scimitar is pretty low as well here. Let's see if the buyers are below 180. They are 185 to 175. I would not risk more than one, but you're buying below the entire chart. So if you are looking for that Tech 2 investment, it makes sense. Then we get the Widow, seeing that pressure as well. Good news, I would say, down to a billion. 1.1 for the sellers, a bit above a billion for the buyers. That means that some people have dumped their Widows to those buyers. And then finally the Zealot, big volumes again that haven't moved the market at all. 200 million to 180 million. Yeah, you could buy one, but honestly I'd wait for another dip to touch 180. That's when you should be able to buy below and have a good stepping point. But right now, a couple of Amar ones that seem pretty interesting. The Ishtar, I think that buy opportunity was last week, and then the Purifier looks pretty juicy on the chart as well. In general though, the sense that I get is that the Tech 2 ship market is pretty stable at the moment, and so if you are trying to do these purchases, don't do so expecting a profit in the next couple of weeks. I would, at the moment, I'm mostly buying when I'm buying, which is not very often. I'm mostly buying for really getting the best possible prices, and my horizon is towards like late this year, maybe early next year or something like that, hoping for a sell opportunity then. After that, the Tech 3 market that's coming in at 42.40. There we go, let's start with the destroyers, and yeah, we're still gonna see if we can make the same story with the confessors going back up above 45 million towards 50 million. That should be good news for this vehicle. 49 for the sellers, 45 for the buyers, and we're basically not seeing any supply come in on the confessor market. So that one got the breathing room, that one got the response. Why the hell doesn't this vehicle? The Hecate is slowly making its way down to 50 million, so that one should have supply. It's 50.5 million for the sellers, 47 million for the buyers. There's the last 24 hours, 18 here, 18 here. Quite a bit of supply here over the last week or so. So the Hecate is definitely taking in activity for the Tech 3 crew destroyers. And then the Jackdaw is actually making its way up to 50 55 million ISK, 55 million for the sellers, 50 million for the buyers. That should also see a little bit of supply coming. Yeah, 20-ish ships, it's not that much, but we are seeing that happen here. So will the Zwepel have a move? It actually has a move down. How the hell does that happen when one goes for 55 million, the other go for 50 million, and here's the Zwepel that's going down to 43 million for the sellers, 40 million for the buyers. Honestly, I'd buy one or two. To me, it does make sense to at least try that, because the Confessor is still running dry as well. Hecate has some, but 50 plus million. Jackdaw should get all of the attention now, selling for 55 million. Eventually, we should run out of Zwepels. We're definitely running out of demand for Zwepels, so these are going 40 million. It's like 15 million less than a Jackdaw. There's gotta be at some point an economics number that gets reached where it's like, you know what, just fielding a Zwepel fleet at this point just makes sense rather than another Jackdaw fleet that's going for 55 million. The difference is that big. So in my opinion, and I mean I've been predicting this for like the last couple of months now, so I've definitely been either early or wrong on this, but in my opinion you get another nice jumping opportunity to grab a very cheap Zwepel close to 40 million ISK, which eventually all of that action in the other Tech 3 destroyers should provide you with the opportunity to sell at a better price than what we're seeing now. But will it happen? Well, the market will of course decide. And then we've got the cruisers. Here is the Legion, all right, breaking down below 180 million for the first time. That's definitely interesting. 175 to 165. It's something we again haven't seen since like March. If you're feeling like gambling, then buying a Legion at the moment from the buy orders, to me, makes sense as something to try. The Loki is bouncing quite healthily back to its average of 200 million, 200 for the sellers, 184 for the buyers, so that's a no. Then we get the Proteus also bouncing back to that above 180 normal price, 183 to 166. Yeah, big margin, but the chart's not there. I don't think you're going to grab any cheap ones, and the Tengu was up here as well, back above 200 million. So here again we have three of them that actually have a little bit of a bounce towards average, slightly high prices, and then the Legion is doing something completely different. This does feel like if you're feeling like gambling on a Tech 3 cruiser, buy a Legion hull and hope for that it can also bounce after all the others did. To me, that would make a little bit of sense, but yeah, again, I'm not seeing that same dynamic which we have seen over the last couple of years in the destroyers play out in the cruiser market. Here it's more straight up gambling, because these markets are small enough that they can be completely manipulated. And then finally, we've got the extra product, and we're just going to go down the line. We did battleships, cruisers. Now we're going to take a look at faction frigates, coming in at 46.55. And there we go. So we've got frigates. Let's start with the pirate faction frigates. That should see those high prices as well, because they also changed with industry to become far more expensive. And so here we've got the Astero, started at probably a 55 million is range, and is now costing over 100 million for an Astero, double basically the price from a year ago on the industry changes. The Crewer, 40 million to 60 million, a little bit less popular if I'm not mistaken. The Crewer 65 to 60 million, so definitely still expensive, but only like a 50% increase. It's relatively tame. Then we get the Daredevil that went from 65 to 90 million, actually also a 50% jump, 92 million to 83 million for the Daredevil. Definitely good news, of course, for players that love my activity, exploration, even in HiSec. Daredevil blueprints, Dramiel blueprints, Succubus blueprints, all those things do drop from exploration sites in HiSec, and so there you do get like 90 million back for one of these. Now that does feel good to see that to drop, make your Daredevil, sell it at these high prices. That's pretty cool, of course. It does take more to build them now. Like here the Dramiel, 1 year high point going above 70 million, so most of these pirate factions seem to have shot up by like 50%. Look at the availability. That's gone way down, 75 million for the sellers, 63 for the buyers, 1 year high point. Then we get the Garmer from 50 to 80 million, same story, yeah, around 50% increase in price. Succubus from 40 million, let's say, to 86. This one has more than doubled, coming down from a 1 year high point, cost over 100 million ISK not that long ago. So that's in Sansha, that's in the Mars space. That's definitely a nice drop to receive at the moment. And then finally the Worm, basically the Gila of these frigates with the amazing drone capabilities, very useful in the Abyss as well. Went from 50 to 90 million, so not actually a doubling in price, but of course these pirate faction ships costing definitely above 50 million and close to 100 million for a lot of these are very expensive all of a sudden. It's again the industry changes in April that have done all of this. Then we get the Navy factions. Here is the Caldari Navy Hookbill. That's right away in a completely different price range, 15 million for the sellers, 13 million for the buyers. Yeah, pretty much where we started the year at. Very good May, June, a little bit of a dip here in August, and then a little bit of recovery. Not much to say. Then we've got the Federation Navy Comet above 15 million, yes, 17 for the sellers. Slightly expensive, I would say, for Galente, so it does feel like Caldari is winning out. They got the cheaper LP, and Galente is struggling a little bit, so they've got expensive LP, and thus the Federation Navy Comet is on the high side. Imperial Navy Slicer, 10 million-ish, 11 million for the sellers, 10 million for the buyers. So this one I would say low, and then the Firetail high, yeah, relatively high, but it's not that visible of a difference. It's 14 million for the sellers. Then we get our unique Skybreaker for Edencom, of course, 95 million ISK. It's a little bit of, in my opinion, that same story that we saw with Tech2. Whatever is Edencom / Triglavian related is like premium content. Definitely, it requires dedication to go into those spaces, to have activities around there. But there's a big part of the player base that really enjoys that. But those ships are like very expensive at the moment. Compare that to the other Navy faction ships, like a 10 million Crucifier that definitely feels low on the chart. And the Griffin Navy Issue, 15 million. Maulus is actually expensive. Galente is clearly expensive at the moment, 19 million, 20 million on the chart. And then the Vigil is actually inexpensive all of a sudden. After reaching 40 million all of a sudden, it dips down to 14 million, and there's really not a lot of buyers for the Vigil fleet issue. This chart, if you're looking like something where you want to gamble on, perhaps you can try to buy a cheap Vigil fleet issue at the moment. But that again shows that very big difference now between pirate faction ships and Navy faction ships, with the pirate factions being very expensive, difficult to make. Makes sense to me, right? It is pirate tech. Concord not too happy with any of that stuff, and then Navy factions, that's that would fund Edencom, would fund the empires, and so these are made available at far lower prices. But it's pretty obvious that that's the new state for all of these faction ships, and the super visibility of, all right, Galente is winning, their ships are very cheap, Caldari is losing, they are very expensive. That has gone way down in visibility because LP, of course, is no longer just like a PvE grind that you can do and that you can very easily bot. PvP activities are far more rewarding in that respect. And that's going to be it for this Eve Talk. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.